Thank you. What a great gathering. Well, you heard just now that I won the TED Prize in 2008. And they give you some money, but they also give you a wish for a better world, which they will try to make happen. And I knew exactly what I wanted from the start, because it's long been a source of frustration to me that religion, which should be making a major contribution to one of the chief tasks of our time, which is to build a global community where people of all persuasions and ethnicities can live together in harmony, is understandably seen as part of the problem. Each one of them, as you've just heard, has developed its own version of the golden rule. Each one of them says that this, do unto others or don't do to others what you would not like them to do to you, is the core of faith. It's the test of true spirituality. And they also say that you cannot confine your compassion to your own group. You must have what one of the Chinese sages called yan ai, concern for everybody. Honor and love the stranger, says Leviticus. Love your enemies, said Jesus. Reach out to all tribes and nations, says the Quran. And yet, you never hear about it. All too often when religious people come together, they talk about things like homosexuality and, or are condemning this or condemning that, or talking about an abstruse point of doctrine. And yet I also knew from my travels, that wherever I go, east or west, there is a yearning for a more compassionate world, a more compassionate form of religion, indeed. And so I asked Ted to help me create, craft, and propagate a charter for compassion. And it was written by a panel of 20 leading activists and thinkers representing 6 of the major world faiths: Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Confucianism, Buddhism, and Hinduism. And this was a demonstration that despite at a time when religions are generally thought to be at loggerheads, on this we could all agree, and we could reach across the divide and work for a better world. And the Charter has now become a global movement. Interestingly, you'll be interested to hear that the people who've come forward most to help me have been businessmen. We've now got businessmen in Google and Microsoft in Seattle working hard for a better world. Because businessmen, it's great for me. I'm an ideas person. I'm not so good at putting this into, translating an idea into practical strategy. And that's what businessmen are good at. And also in the Middle East and in Pakistan. Pakistan has become the leader of the Charter. And the point about it is that it's not enough to say we all love each other, and the Charter was never meant to be just a feel-good thing. It was meant to inspire action. How do we insert the golden rule into the difficult circumstances of the 21st century? Because we have to do it. It's no longer just a nice thing to do. Because the bottom line is that unless we now implement the golden rule globally, treating all peoples, all nations, as we would wish to be treated ourselves, we are not going to have a viable world. And if you like to ask the kind of projects that we're doing, I'll be able to tell you in question time. But it is all practical in terms of education, business, and I've just come back from Washington, arrived yesterday morning home, and now one of the leading Muslim societies in America is taking the Charter on board, going to try to insert it into imam training. And also the Brookings Institute, a think tank, is behind the Charter, especially in their work in creating better relations between the Middle East and the Islamic world and the United States. But you see, what is compassion? Because I think the word has sort of so far dropped out of our lexicon that people often seem to think it means feeling sorry for people. I gave a lecture a few years back in Holland, and I specifically said, compassion does not mean feeling sorry for people, and I went on to say what it was. But every time I mentioned the word compassion, in the Dutch translation of my speech in the newspaper, they translated it pity. And in fact, my book, 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life, is now in Dutch. And they had a hard job because they said, we haven't got a word for compassion. And this tells us something. The idea has got sort of stampeded to the background. And one of the points of the Charter is to bring it from the lumber room of our minds into the forefront of our consciousness. So what is it? Well, it is expressed in the Golden Rule. Confucius was once asked by his disciples, Master, which one of your teachings can we practice all day and every day? And what is the central thread that runs through all your teaching and brings it all together? And he answered, Shu, which means likening to oneself. Look into your own heart, discover what it is that gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstance whatsoever to inflict that pain on anybody else. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. And notice Confucius is saying all day and every day, because very often when we are we've done something nice for somebody, we often say, well, that's my good deed for the day, as though we could then return to the next 23 hours to our usual lives of selfishness and bitterness. But all day and every day. Why have they done this, the religions? Because it takes you beyond ego. You have, as the Charter says, to dethrone yourself from the center of your world and put another there. And it is ego that holds us back from enlightenment and from our best selves. In the English word compassion, of course, comes from a Greek and Latin root, meaning to endure something with somebody else. Kompathein, to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, again, all day and every day, getting outside your own selfish and self-interested parameters. In Arabic, and similarly in Hebrew, the word Rahman, Al-Rahman, it comes from the word Rahmat, womb. It's related etymologically to the word Raham, for womb. And that brings in the whole ethos of mother love. Now, the vision of the mother and child is very evocative. It's found in all cultures as a symbol of our essential humanity. And yet mother love is hard. A mother has to get up every night to her crying child, no matter how exhausted she is. She has to put her own needs and frustrations and ambitions on the back burner and be aware of what that child is doing at every second of the day, taking absolute responsibility for her. And then that cute little baby grows up and could become an awful disappointment. But the mother never gives up on the child, no matter what. There's an early Buddhist prayer associated with the Buddha. It's thought to be his poem that says, "Let us cherish all creatures as a mother her only child." We have to have that same sense of responsibility and care, even when we feel we'd like to murder that child. We have to have them, however disappointing and disillusioning our fellow creatures, whoever they are, may be. That is the task of our time. And that's very much strong in Buddhism. Karuna in Sanskrit. It means, it doesn't mean just feeling sorry for people. It is a principled determination to end the suffering we see all around us. What we all share is pain. Even a privileged person like myself knows pain and misery and suffering, and even the most fortunate person will, as the Buddhists always say, endure sickness and death. And if you're lucky, perhaps or perhaps not, the indignities and humiliation of old age. Pain is something we share, and it's something we often want to block off from ourselves because we always look on the bright side of life, as Monty Python said. But sometimes we need to look at the pain of the world and not just empathize in front and shed a tear, but work actively to end it wherever we see it. That is our task. Because we cannot honestly expect our governments or our enemies or the governments of our enemies to behave in a more compassionate, peace-loving way if we ourselves, in our personal daily lives, give way to unexamined prejudice. We can't expect other people to behave better than we do ourselves. So I wrote this book because I kept going around talking about the Charter, and people kept on saying, A, what is compassion? And B, how on earth do we do this? The demands are huge. So I called it 12 Steps to a Compassionate Life. And you'll recognize the reference to Alcoholics Anonymous. I have to explain that carefully in a Muslim country when I'm talking about compassion. But they say, that, yeah, it's okay. They said, we have it for Narcotics Anonymous, so we know all about that. That's quite deliberate, because, you know, we're addicted to our pet hates and our prejudices. We don't know what we'd do without them. I sometimes see mutinous expressions crossing people's faces. What? Does that mean I can never again sound off about my annoying sibling or my appalling boss? And yet, this is what we have to do now globally. And so we can't, because of this addiction, you know, sometimes when we say something very clever and unpleasant about people, and I do this a lot myself, I have a very sharp tongue that I learned at my Reverend Mother's knee and at the University of Oxford. So you have to sort of to watch that a bit. But we have now, we get that sort of buzz sometimes. We hear our own cleverness. And we get that sort of buzz of righteousness or joy, just like the first hit of the day, or your first cigarette in the days when we smoked. But at the same time, you are poisoning yourself, and you're poisoning the intellectual and spiritual and moral environment around you. So 12 steps, it was simply helping you step by step, slowly, to wean yourself away from these prejudices on which we depend, often for our own sense of who we are. Now, you'll be relieved to know I'm not going to plod through all 12 steps right now. We start off quite simply learning about compassion. But I just want to focus on 3 of them. Step 7. It's called How Little We Know. This is the age of information. And we click on a mouse and we get upcome websites and information on any amount of stuff. And we're encouraged to voice our opinions, quite rightly, but sometimes when we're listening to some of those talk shows or phone-ins that clog our airways, if you happen to know something about this subject under discussion, the amount of reliable information that is being shared could often be comfortably contained on the back of a small postcard. And we are very omniscient in the way we speak to one another. Oh, the trouble with her is, we say. Or, well, you know, she's always. As though in a single sentence you can sum up the mystery of the other person. I don't know about you, but I often surprise myself. I find it a great difficulty in understanding why I act as I do. And people pay good money to go to psychoanalysts to help them understand themselves. And how much do we really know about the person we sit next to in the office? What do we know about what makes him or her wake up in the middle of the night with a pang of embarrassment or pain? What do we know about his or her history? What tragedy they may have, what sickness they may have in their lives? And yet we sum them up and dismiss them in our ordinary conversation. And we do it with whole cultures and whole civilizations too. What I'm involved with, trying to improve relations with the Muslim world, oh, well, the trouble with Islam is, as though you could sum up a complex religious tradition and its multifarious ways of expressing itself, and the millions, billions of people who participated in a particular nation or in a particular tradition, and sum it up in a single sentence. And yet how little we know. This is not only against the... I'm sorry to keep drawing on religion, but it's the way I earn my living. And it's what has taught me about compassion. But Socrates, founder of the Western rational tradition, would have little truck with this kind of omniscience. People, when they came to Socrates, always thought they knew what they were talking about. But after half an hour of Socrates' relentless questioning, they realized that they didn't know the first thing about the subject under discussion. Well, even such basic matters as goodness or courage, even though they might have been veterans of the Peloponnesian War and had endured the terror of the battlefield, they found when push came to shove, under Socrates' relentless reasoning, that they didn't know the first thing about it. And a Socratic dialogue, as recorded by Plato, always ends with the participants scratching their heads and saying, we don't know anything at all. At the end of the one on courage, these three generals say, we now have to go back to school and start again. And at that moment, Socrates said, you've become a philosopher. Because a philosopher word means a lover of wisdom. Because you know you don't have it. And you know you will pursue it as fast, as ardently as you pursue a lover, a beloved object. At the end, on the last day of his life, Plato says, Socrates said that he was wise in only one respect, that he knew nothing at all. And there's very early in my studies, when I was sort of still reeling and angry from all the dogmatism of my religious tradition, I encountered this quotation from a Sufi philosopher of the 12th and 13th century, Ibn Arabi, a very influential philosopher. And I'd like to share it with you. He's talking about the absurdities of religious dogma. But we all have our pet dogmas and our pet certainties. And he's asking us really to open our hearts and minds to other people's way of doing things. The Sufi tradition in Islam has an outstanding appreciation of other religious faiths. This is far more authentic than Osama bin Laden. It's quite common for a Sufi mystic like Ibn Arabi, who's written poems about this, to say that once you're in you've glimpsed what we call divine, you are neither a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim. You're at home equally in a synagogue, a temple, a mosque, or a church, because once you've glimpsed the transcendent, these man-made boundaries fade away. And here's what he says. When he used the word faith, just think of your own pet ideology. Do not praise your own faith so exclusively that you disbelieve all the rest. If you do this, you will miss much good. Nay, you'll fail to understand the real truth of the matter. God, the omniscient and omnipresent, cannot be confined to any one creed. For he says in the Quran, wheresoever ye turn, there is the face of Allah. Everybody praises what he knows. His God is his own creature, and in praising it, he praises himself, which he would not do if he were just, but his dislike is based on ignorance. And that ignorance that we have, and we should just realize how ignorant we all are about other people, even our nearest and dearest. There's a quotation from Hamlet that's always meant a great deal for me. I'm sure you all know the plot of Hamlet, but just in case, Hamlet's causing a lot of trouble at the court of Denmark. And so the king sets two of his friends, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, to spy upon him. And it doesn't take Hamlet long to find out what's going on. And one evening he comes to Guildenstern with a pipe. And he says, "I pray you, play upon this pipe." "My lord, I cannot." "Well, it's as easy as lying," says Hamlet caustically. And then, in here I paraphrase, obviously, he says, "It's a simple matter, you just blow down this tube, wiggle your fingers around, and out comes the music." "My lord, I have not the skill," says Guildenstern. "Why, look you now," says Hamlet, "what a poor thing you would make of me. You would play upon me like this pipe. You would pull out all the stops. You would play me to the top of my bent. You would pluck out the heart of my mystery." And how often we pluck out the heart of the essential mystery that is each human being in order to serve some kind of agenda of our own. And next step, 8, is how do we speak? How should we speak to one another? We're a very argumentative and opinionated society, we are often very aggressive in the way we promote our opinions. But again, let's go back to Socrates. Nobody could win a Socratic dialogue, because the Socratic dialogue ends with everybody realizing they don't know anything at all. There was no way that you could have a Socratic dialogue and be aggressive. At each point, Plato says, the participants in a dialogue must be in accord with one another. Nobody must be shoved or pushed into a position that and it was he, of course, in those days, didn't want to go to. At each point, you had to listen to what the other person was telling you and allow it to change you and to shift your own opinions. And then you offered your opinion so that your opinion entered the mind of the other. We talk very glibly about dialogue in these days. Dialogue with this and dialogue with that, as if we only all engage in dialogue, peace would break out. But there's not much actual dialogue really going on. Very often what dialogue means is trying to bludgeon the other side into accepting our opinion. That's not dialogue, that's diatribe. And there's no point in entering into dialogue if you're not prepared to be changed. That doesn't mean you just keel over and just accept the other person's point of view, but that you are somehow altered by the encounter. Allow the other person the chance to change your mind. And that doesn't mean changing your opinion, but changing your mind, the way you approach the other. And yet often in our dialogue or debate, it's not enough for us in politics, the media, academia, to seek the truth. We also have to belittle, discredit, and humiliate our opponents, make him or her look a fool. And again, Socrates wouldn't have liked that. Now, there are times when we have to speak out, and we have to speak out wherever we find cruelty, injustice, distress, unfairness. But here I take a leaf out of Gandhi's book, when asked how do we oppose the British government, he said, "I cannot allow myself to hate the British." because then they would have won. And when you are, say, speaking out against an abuse, ask yourself before you speak whether you're speaking in anger, whether you're seeking really to ameliorate the situation, or whether you're speaking to punish or to injure, to utter that withering word that often stays in people's minds and hearts for a long time. That is compassionate speech, means not finding a way of speaking in a way that is firm and clear, but not injurious. Because I know from the whole point about dealing with religious extremism, this is just one example from my line of country, that invariably when extremist movements, whatever they are attacked, either with guns or in the media, they almost invariably, historically it's shown, become more extreme. When people attack, then you immediately become more entrenched in your views, because most of these movements are rooted in a profound fear of annihilation of various kinds. Somehow, I was just speaking to some evangelicals just on Tuesday in Washington, a lunch group of evangelicals, congressmen, members of the CIA, business people, clergy, etc. And the host was really egging them on. He said, please attack her. And they didn't. There's a way you can point out your views without. I always take as a checklist, I'm sorry again, here we come back to religion, but St. Paul's hymn on charity. Charity, see if I can tick these boxes. Charity is patient. It's kind. It is not puffed up. Sometimes when people are inveighing against a particular abuse, that you can almost see them swelling before your eyes with delighted self-congratulation. In praising your opinion, said in Arabic, you're praising yourself. So, and charity, says St. Paul, takes no delight in the wrongdoing of others. And often when people are inveighing against an abuse, they are literally smacking their lips with delight at being able to denounce this. Takes no delight in the wrongdoing of others, because we've all got wrong. We are, every single one of us, flawed beings. We all have things. I'm not talking about really interesting abuses, but those nasty little meannesses, those self-indulgent fantasies that we don't want anybody to know about, anybody at all. And very often, a psychologist could tell you that when people are inveighing against a particular abuse, they often have a bit of it themselves. It's something that we can't, if we can't accept the flaw and the dark side of ourselves, we're not going to be able to accept it in others too. So speak out. Now I'm going to finish now with the 12th step, which is one we're doing all our lives. Love your enemies. Now, I need to do a bit of decoding here. When Jesus said that, we use the word love so glibly in our society. You know, I love ice cream, I'd love a gin and tonic, I absolutely love that movie. And it's also associated with emotion, you know, all you need is love and a warm gush of feeling. This compassion is not about feeling. You can feel compassion, but feelings come and go. They depend on how good a night's sleep you've had or the state of your digestion, very often. But they come and go. Jesus was not telling us to be filled with soggy affection for our enemies. The word he was probably using was hesed, which doesn't mean love in our sense, it means loyalty. He's doing a bit of midrashic, rabbinic interpretation of Scripture. Love your neighbor, says Leviticus. Yes, said Jesus, but also love your enemy, taking it that step further. Love, hesed, it was a term used in international treaties. It was a legal term. Leviticus is a legal text. And talk about touchy-feely emotion would be as out of a place in Leviticus as it would be in a Supreme Court ruling. Two kings would promise to love each other, which didn't mean they would fall into each other's arms, but that they would be loyal to one another. They may have been enemies before, but they would now look out for each other's practical interests, come to their aid in time of trouble, look out for their best interests rather than just the interests of your own kingdom. Now, this is the kind of love we now have to have with the people we call our enemies, because if we don't, the world is not going to be viable. You'll be relieved to hear we're now leaving religion behind, in a way, and returning to the Greeks, who in the 5th century, at the height of their achievements rationally, invented the genre of tragic drama. And it was, I'm afraid, part of a religious festival. Each year, the leading dramatists of Athens would compete with one another on the festival of Dionysus, god of transformation. And what they were doing was putting suffering on stage. Instead of allowing us to push suffering and pain to the back burner, and we don't want to see it, bring it to the forefront of people's minds. They usually took the form, these plays, of a retelling, a recasting, often a radical recasting of one of the ancient Greek myths. And you saw a man or a woman in an extremity of agony, coping with utter misery. And they put suffering on stage. And periodically, the leader of the chorus would say, "Now weep. Weep for Oedipus, a man who'd broken every taboo in the book, a man whom they'd normally shun. Weep for Heracles, a man driven mad by the goddess Hera, who in his divinely inspired frenzy had killed his wife and children." Weep, and the Greeks did weep. They weren't like modern Western men and gulp and wipe an embarrassed tear from the corner of their eye. They wept aloud, because they believed that weeping together created a bond between people. When they saw this suffering, they realized they were not alone in their pain. That is the one thing that human beings share, is we all have pain. Now, the first of these tragedies to come down to us to have survived is Aeschylus's The Persians. And it was presented just a few years after the Athenians had defeated the Persian army in the landmark battle of Salamis. But before that, before they'd achieved victory, the Persian army had rampaged through Athens and trashed the city. It had burned, looted, and pillaged. And then it went up to the Acropolis, the sacred hill outside the city, and smashed to pieces all the beautiful, newly erected temples on that sacred hill. And now Aeschylus is asking the Athenians to weep for the Persians. Usually these plays, in their mythical presentation, were touching on something that was going on in the city at that time. It was a sort of communal meditation, and everybody had to go. It wasn't a question of saying, "Have you caught the latest Aeschylus?" You had to go. It was a civic duty. People were even let out of jail. It was a communal meditation upon the plight of the city that year. Weep now for the Persians. And there's not a hint of triumphalism, no gloating. The Persians are presented as a noble race, equal with Athens in dignity and splendor. And they're presented as a people in mourning. Aeschylus is asking them, his audience, to see the pain of the Persians, to look at things from the point of view of the vanquished. And after, I was back in Washington for the 10-year commemoration of 9/11 in September. And I asked my audiences there, could you put on a play on Broadway, and so to make your audience weep for what has happened in the Muslim world since 9/11. But this goes very deep in Greek culture, right back to the Iliad. which, as you know, tells the story of one small incident in the long 10-year war between the Greeks and the Trojans. And in this, Achilles, the chief warrior on the Greek side, has a quarrel with his king. And he behaves egotistically, in a fit of pique. He takes his men out of the war and goes and sulks in his tent. And this is disastrous for the Greek side. They need Achilles and they need his warriors. And in the ensuing confusion, Patroclus, Achilles' beloved friend, is killed by Hector, one of the Trojan princes. And Achilles, normally a tender-hearted man, goes mad with grief, rage, and guilt. Even the gods are shocked, and they say he's lost it. And he challenges Hector to a duel. And the two men fight it out before both the armies watching on either side, and in front of Hector's family, the royal family of Troy, who are watching from the city walls. And of course, Achilles kills Hector. And he mutilates the body. He ties it to the back of his chariot and drives it round and round Patroclus' grave. And then he does a terrible thing. He refuses to give Patroclus' body back to the family for burial. And that will mean, according to the Greek ethos, that Patroclus' soul would never know rest. No, Hector's soul, I'm sorry. Hector's soul would never know rest. It would wander distressed and restless and miserable for all eternity. It's a complete breaking of a taboo. But then one night, into the Greek camp comes Priam, the old king of Troy, to beg for the body of his son. And he comes in disguise, and he gets to Achilles' tent, and he throws off his disguise, and of course everybody is shocked. And then the old man falls at Achilles' feet, and he embraces his knees, and he weeps. He weeps not just for Hector, but for all the sons he's had who've been killed by Achilles. And Achilles looks at the old man weeping, and he remembers his own father, and he begins to weep too. And the two men weep together. Achilles, now, says Homer, now for his father, now for Patroclus, and Priam for all his sons. And then they stop. They've created that bond. And the two men look at each other. And Achilles then goes and fetches Hector's body, and he carries it and lays it very tenderly in the arms of the old man, fearful that the weight will be too much. And then there's a numinous silence when they both look into each other's eyes, and each sees the other as divine, as godlike. That, in my book, is what divinity is. When we realize that our enemies also have pain.